from today onwards, we'll be starting actually. So before going to your Spring Boot framework, we have to understand about the Spring framework actually. Already we have discussed about the Spring framework. We have discussed actually. And so before getting into the Spring Boot, we have to understand about the Spring framework and why it is so famous actually. And we have already discussed whenever we studied about your Spring framework actually. And there are certain problems in the case of your traditional approach actually. So in the traditional approaches, that is J2EE traditional approaches, what are the components you have studied actually?
JSP
servlets as well as your EJP concept actually. Okay, so before your Spring Boot occurs, okay, before your Spring Boot is developed actually, so we have your Spring framework actually, and before your Spring framework is developed, we have your traditional approach, J2EE traditional approach, which is your JSP servlets as well as your EJP concept actually. Okay, JSP servlet as well as your EJP concept actually. So in order to understand the famous of your Spring framework, we have to go to the year 2000 actually. In this time, if I want to create any project in J2EE, okay, if I want to create any project in J2EE, we always uses your J2EE components like your JSP servlets as well as your EJP components we are using actually. And at that time, EJP is one of a famous technology you can able to say at that time, before your Spring have occurred, at that time you can able to say EJP is one of the famous technology, and it is provided with many features like messaging, lookup for the entities like that. It will be provided with so many features it was provided actually. But the only problem with that EJP, it is very difficult to manage them actually, because in EJP we have 3 types of beans are available: session bean, entity bean, as well as your message driven bean actually. And in the case of entity bean, what we can do? What is the purpose of the entity bean? Yeah.
Map with the database table.
It is mainly used for storing inside the databases actually. Okay. So since we are going to work with an entity, it becomes a heavy object actually. Okay, it becomes a heavy object. So that's where the people comes into a concept called as your framework actually. That is your Spring framework actually. And whenever you develop any Spring framework, we'll be always developing one program. We'll be developing what program we'll develop?
Bean program.
Bean program, or that Bean program is otherwise called as what?
Pojo.
Pojo section. So whatever the feature that is present in the case of your EJP concept, those feature I can able to achieve in the case of your Spring framework just with a single program called as
Pojo or Bean.
Pojo class or a Bean class. Pojo class or a Bean class. So in the year 2000, okay, and in the year 2000, if I want to develop any J2EE based application, normally we'll be going for this JSP servlets and EJP only. So at that time, EJP is one of the most popular technology you can able to say, and it was provided with so many features like under messaging, lookup, and for the entities like that, it was provided so many features. But since even though I'm going to use my entities and all, it becomes a heavy object actually. So for that purpose, only we have introduced a framework called as your Spring framework. And what is an advantage of using the Spring framework now? Whatever the feature that is present in the case of EJP, I can do in my Spring framework just with a simple Bean program or a Pojo class. Just with a simple Bean program or a Pojo class actually. And how I can able to do it? The Spring framework is provided with one important feature called as what feature?
Dependency injection.
Okay. So with the help of this dependency injection, wherever I want to inject it, I can able to inject the values at which time I can able to inject it.
Runtime.
And where I can able to do this injection and all in a separate
XML file.
And another advantage of using your Spring framework is that the Spring framework can also integrate with other frameworks also. We can able to integrate like Hibernate structs also. I can able to integrate with your Spring framework. So the Spring framework becomes more popular after your EJP components actually, because it provided with a very important feature called as your dependency injection. And if I want to write any cross-cutting functionality in a single place, and if I want to use in other program now, what feature my Spring provides?
Spring AOP.
AOP concept, aspect-oriented programming actually. It was provided with your AOP concept also. So and this Spring can also integrated with other frameworks also. It can be integrated, and like Hibernate as well as your structs also, it can be integrated. But whenever we talk about the Spring, so Spring is a
Framework.
framework. And as you already told now, what I have to do if it is a framework now?
Persisting the
No. If it is a framework means what I have to do?
Download jar files.
separate jar
files
files.
actually. Okay, download all the jar files. So one of the problem with the Spring framework is that whenever we are going to build any large application in the case of your Spring framework, we need more jar files are needed actually. Okay, we need more jar files are needed actually. But here, instead of using jar file, what we are using actually?
Form.xml file.
Where the form.xml is present. Even if I use my form.xml also, in my form.xml I have to provide so many
Dependencies.
Yes, I have to provide so many dependencies. I have to provide it. So whenever you're going to build any larger application in the case of your Spring framework, we need more jar files are needed, and the external configurations, and we have to create a separate XML file. And whenever you create any Bean program, that Bean program should be configured in
XML file.
File actually. So we have to write so many external configuration. I have to do it actually. But as a developer, if I'm going to develop any project now, as a developer, I need to focus only on the coding part actually. I should not sit and download the jar files, or I should not do all the external configuration and all. That is one problem with the help of which framework?
Spring
Spring
framework.
Spring framework actually. Yes, Spring framework is also one of a successful framework only, you can say. But the problem is that as a developer, we need to focus only on the coding part actually, rather than sitting and downloading the jar file and doing all your external configuration actually. So for that purpose only, we have introduced a concept called as
Spring Boot.
Spring Boot.
Spring Boot framework. Okay, we have introduced a concept called your Spring Boot framework actually. And you should and you can able to say the Spring Boot is not a replacement of your Spring framework. It is not a replacement of your Spring framework. In the Spring Boot also, we are going to use the same thing that is present in the case of your Spring framework only. But what is only one advantage is now in the case of your Spring Boot, we don't need to download any
Jar
Jar
file.
file.
or there is no need to do any external configuration at all. So it will be giving a production ready project. It will be giving. So as a developer, we have to write only the
Coding part.
part only. You have to write it. Your Spring Boot will be giving a production ready application, a project. It will be giving with all the necessary informations. It will be giving actually. So as a developer, I have to directly write only the code. Okay, as a developer, you have to write only the code actually. So for that purpose, only you will be going for your Spring Boot concept actually. So as I already told before, and if, in earlier days and all, if I want to develop any J2W application, means we always go for a concept called
Spring framework.
guys, listen to my questions properly. In earlier days, asking. In earlier days, if I want to develop any each application, you have to go for
J2W components.
J2W components like what?
EJB.
Servlet concept actually. But whenever you talk about this EJP is also one of a popular technology at that time actually. But it provided so many features like messaging, lookup for the entity and all. But since we are using your entity, it becomes your heavy object. It will be becoming. And even if I want to insert a single row, we have to write so many code. We have to write it actually. So for that purpose, one day, we have introduced a concept called as your
Spring framework.
Spring framework.
What is the Spring framework now? And whatever the feature that is present in the case of your EJP, I can able to do in my Spring framework just with a single class called as
Bean class.
class for a bean class actually. Yeah, and the Spring framework provides a very important feature called as your dependency injection, AOP concept like that. It was provided with very important feature, and we can able to integrate your Spring framework with other frameworks like Hibernate as well as your structs and all. Yes, the Spring framework is also a more successful framework only. But the problem with the Spring framework is that we have to download so many
Jar files.
and I write so many external configuration if I'm going to develop any large application I'm going to develop it. So as a developer, I need to focus only on the logic or on the coding part actually, rather than sitting and downloading all the jar file and doing all your external configuration. So for that purpose only, we have introduced a framework called as
Spring Boot.
Spring Boot framework.
actually. So again, Spring Boot is not a replacement of your Spring framework. Whatever we are going to do in the case of Spring, the same thing only we are going to do in the case of your Spring Boot. But what is an advantage of Spring Boot? A production ready application. Okay, it is going to provide a production ready application. So as a developer, we are going to focus only on the
Coding part.
as a developer, we are going to focus only on the coding part. We are going to focus it. We are not going to download any jar file, and we are not going to what is it? We are not going to do any external configuration. We are not going to do it. So for that purpose only, you will be going for a concept called as your Spring Boot framework. You will be for a concept called as your Spring Boot framework. There are guys about your introduction
Yes,
to
sir.
the Spring framework.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, so now we are going to start with your Spring Boot framework actually. We are going to start with your Spring Boot framework actually. So it is also one of an open source Java based framework to create faster application. So if I want to create any faster application now, in that case, you can go for a concept called as your Spring Boot concept actually. So it is also an open source Java based framework. In order to create your faster application, I can go for a concept called as your Spring Boot framework actually. And this Spring Boot developed by a team called as your Pivotal team. Okay, it is developed by a team called as your Pivotal team. So developed by Pivotal team. It is developed by your Pivotal team. It was developed. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So it is also one of a Java-based framework. In order to develop your in order to develop your faster application, I can go for the Spring Boot framework. I can go for, and it is developed by a team called as your Pivotal team. Okay, it is developed by a team called as your Pivotal team. Okay. And next, we are going to discuss about the advantage of using your Spring Boot concept. Actually, the first advantage, it is easy to understand. It is easy to understand. and develop faster application. Okay, it is very simple concept only. Develop faster application. So it will be always easy to understand. And why we are going for the Spring Boot now, in order to develop your faster application, we can go for the Spring Boot concept. Since it is used to develop your faster application, it is going to increase your productivity. It is going to increase your productivity, and it is going to reduces your development time. Okay, it is going to reduces your development time. It will be reduced, and it is going to increase your productivity of your application. And one more very, very important advantage of using this particular Spring Boot framework is that, and as I already told before, in the case of your Spring framework, like, we have to download so many jar file, and what we have to do, we have to do all the
Configuration.
And where we doing all the configuration?
XML file.
XML.
One more important advantage of using your Spring Boot is that avoid your XML.
Configuration.
Okay, there is no need to go for an XML configuration in the case of your Spring Boot actually. The Spring Boot, and everything is going to be auto configured. Okay, avoid your XML configuration, and in the case of your Spring Boot, everything is going to be
Automatically.
okay, everything is going to be auto configured. We are not going to do any configuration. We are not going to do, everything is going to be auto configured in the case of your Spring Boot concept. And the next advantage of using your Spring Boot is that, okay, and actually we didn't study that particular module in the case of your Spring framework actually. And so how many modules does my Spring framework provides?
7
Seven modules. Yeah. So we have discussed only 2 modules called as
Spring
Four
Boot
modules.
4
and
modules, context module.
Context
actually.
module.
Yeah. We have AOP module, DAO module, ORM module, Webflow module, and the last module is called as what?
MVC module.
And MVC module actually. And what is that MVC module now? So in the case of your Spring framework itself, if I want to develop any web application based on
MVC
architecture.
so guys,
MVC architecture.
Yeah, MVC architecture. So guys, answer, like, whenever you're going to develop any web application now, compulsory that should be some. Any idea? Whenever you're going to develop any web application, compulsory there should be some. Okay, what is web application now? What is web application means?
Client side application.
Client and
Client server.
Backend
server actually. So we are the client actually. So we are going to give the request to the
server.
server actually. We are going to give the request to the server. So whenever you're going to develop any web application, now obviously there should be some
Request and response.
Request to
where you will give request, and who will give response.
Client will give request and server will give response.
So who is responsible for giving the response?
Server.
Server actually. Yeah. So whenever you're going to develop any web application, compulsory that should be a
Server.
server should be there actually. Okay, that should be a server should be there actually. So if I'm going to develop an EJP application, or if I'm going to develop any and J2W if I'm going to develop any web application based upon EJP concept, or based upon JSP servlets concept, or based upon Spring MVC framework and all, we have to explicitly configure the server actually. Okay, we have to explicitly configure the server. But in case of your Spring Boot is that the Spring Boot comes with your embedded servers. Okay, Spring Boot comes with what? What is embedded server now? What is embedded server? It is by default
Present inside.
inside your embedded server like Tomcat. Okay, so Tomcat server will be there. So this will be the default server. So by default by default your Spring Boot will comes with what server? Tomcat server actually. Okay, that is your default server. Apart from that, we have Jetty server is there, and we have Undertow server. Okay, we have an Undertow server will be there actually. But so that is one of an advantage of using your Spring Boot actually. So if I'm going to develop any web application with the help of JSP or JSP servlets, or with the help of EJP, or with the help of your Spring framework and all, we have to explicitly configure the Tomcat server. Okay, normally we'll be using your Tomcat server. So we have to explicitly configure your Tomcat server actually. But your Spring Boot comes with your inbuilt server or embedded servers like
Tomcat.
Undertow actually. And which server by default it will be coming?
Tomcat.
By default it will be coming with your Tomcat server, or else you can able to change to Jetty server, or you can able to change to your Undertow server actually. Okay, and the next advantage you can able to say about your Spring Boot is that the Spring Boot is mainly you can able to develop a server-side application. Okay, you can able to say it is used to develop what type of application we can able to develop, use it to develop server-side application, or even in simple words, like I can able to say a backend application. Okay, I can able to develop a backend application. So if I talk about backend application, what my backend application will do, the backend application is going to and communicate with what? Database actually. Okay, it is going to communicate with your database actually. So if I'm going to develop my JSP servlets, or I'm going to develop my web application with EJP, or if I'm going to develop my web application with the help of your Spring framework and all, we have to separately create your databases. It might be a MySQL database, an Oracle database, it can be any database actually. But another advantage of using your Spring Boot is that the Spring Boot also comes with an embedded database called as the database. Okay, it comes with your embedded, or you can able to say a in-memory database actually. Okay, in-memory database called as your H2 database. Okay, it is called as your H2 database actually. So your Spring Boot comes with your in-memory or inbuilt database called as your
H2 database.
Inbuilt database called as your H2 databases actually. Okay, and the next advantage of your the Spring Boot framework is that, okay, so whenever you develop any application, okay, if I have to print something in the console now, what I'll be using? System.out.println like that we'll be using actually. Okay, but now I don't want to use my system.out.println. Instead, I want to print in the console using logging framework actually. Okay, so we have a framework called as logging framework actually, like log4j framework and all there. So because if I use my system.out.println and the first time it will be printed, but if I run on the second time now, can I able to see the previously printed information?
No, sir.
No, you can't able to see actually. But I want to log all those information. I want to store those information somewhere now. In that, at the time of printing, I want to store information somewhere now. In that case, I can able to go for a framework called as log4j framework actually. So in the case of your Spring or in the case of your EJP and all, if I want to use my log4j framework now, then we have to configure all the dependency in your pom.xml file. We need to configure manually. We need to configure actually. But another advantage of using your Spring Boot is that the Spring Boot comes with your default logging framework. Spring Boot comes with Spring boot logging boot starter logging which supports default logging framework like